Experts are alarmed. The number of New Zealanders with diabetes is not only growing, it's also getting younger. Diabetes used to mainly affect older adults, but doctors are now warning that type 2 diabetes is becoming more common in young people. It is a trend they say could have serious health, social and economic consequences in the future.
The reach of diabetes is fast growing in New Zealand. It doesn't discriminate and it can be devastating.
Just a quick warning, this next conversation may be a little confronting. The number of diabetes-related lower limb amputations has jumped more than 50% in less than a decade.
And in 2025, diabetes is still proving fatal.
Mum and dad are 30s, maybe 40s, and unfortunately we've had a couple where they've died of renal failure or they're on dialysis.
Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and today on The Detail, we delve into diabetes, the medical condition that affects your body's ability to manage sugar in the blood. It's a serious and growing issue in New Zealand, affecting more than 300,000 Kiwis. Today, we look at type 1 and type 2. What's the difference? Who's more at risk? What's the best treatment? And why, in 2025, is the condition still shrouded in misinformation and uncertainty?
But I think the confusing thing for people is which one's type 1 and which one's type 2, and they are quite different conditions in many ways.
When you tell people that you have diabetes, what is the normal reaction?
They look at you and go, gee, you're kind of skinny and I wouldn't have thought you'd have diabetes. And look, to be fair, I could not believe it when I got diagnosed with it, because I was pretty ignorant too. I couldn't have told you, I don't think.
That's RNZ investigative journalist and host Guyan Espiner, who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes out of the blue back in 2018. At the time, he was 47 and a picture of health. We'll have more of his story, including what it's like to live with diabetes and his recent scare, in a moment. But first, Dr. Craig Jeffries, who specialises in diabetes.
There's a lot of stigma on diabetes. Children on insulin are stigmatised, adults type 2 are stigmatised. I think it's just all of us are at risk, whether it's a random autoimmune event, which is in type 1, or it's a part of ageing or high-risk genes, is that you can't say, only they get it, or we're all in the same boat, and we need to treat it appropriately.
Craig is a paediatric endocrinologist at Starship Hospital and is dealing with a growing number of Kiwi kids with diabetes, both type 1 and 2. Put simply, type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition where the body doesn't produce insulin. It can develop rapidly and is usually diagnosed in childhood. It's not that common and affects up to just 10% of diabetics. Type 2 diabetes is far more common, about 90% of cases, and happens when your body can't use insulin properly. It usually occurs in adults, but more and more children are now being diagnosed. I asked Craig if there is a cure for either type.
Starting with type 1. Type 1 is an autoimmune trigger, and we are still saying to people you'll be on insulin for life. Injections of insulin, pumps of insulin, glucose tech. There are thoughts that we might be able to turn off the immune system, and there is some drugs overseas, there are infusions that may delay the onset of type 1, the autoimmune trigger. But at the moment, there's nothing that can turn off that can replace your insulin. And there's nothing that can take someone even back into what we call a partial honeymoon phase. That is, we don't need to take all the insulin, we can just take some background, etc. That's going to come, because we know in medicine, advances have been slow and then all of a sudden things change. So if we can find a magic infusion that can do that every couple of years, that may go away. Type 2 diabetes, and I look after youth onset, is interesting. It's a condition where very strong family history, often mums with diabetes on insulin and pregnancy. And the kids are nutritionally programmed to store weight, but they're also not the biggest kids. So when we see them at 10 to 12, they often have very high blood sugars. We know that if we can trim some of their weight down, their beta cells or pancreas can work easier and they can go into a remission. And that's always been very hard to do because human nature is we want to store energy, we want to store weight. So we've ended up treating them with oral agents or injections of insulin. Can you get rid of type 2 diabetes? Is interesting. There's always some people who will really get into diet and exercise, be able to trim down, and they'll go into what we call a remission. Most people can't maintain that forever, which is where weight loss surgery has come in, because that's actually been very useful to lose a significant amount of body weight. But even people with established diabetes don't always lose their type 2 diabetes. I've got a good colleague who's had weight loss surgery but still requires lots of medicine. And that's because his ability to make insulin has been long-term changed. There's a recent study showing actually if we can use some of these new magic weight loss drugs, type 2 youth could easily go actually into full remission, off all treatments apart from these agents once a week, lose significant weight, and they won't have diabetes within 4 to 6 weeks if we could get these agents. What's going to happen long term with them, we're not sure, but we could at least push them out of diabetes, put them in a remission, and they could get on with teenage normal life.
God, that's huge. That's exciting. And I want to talk about these young ones because the new stats or stats that have come out say we've got a growing number of young kids who have been diagnosed with diabetes.
Increasingly, we're starting to see younger people now with type 2 diabetes, and we consider this like the rising tide of disease. And it does tend to disproportionately affect Māori and Pacific people.
Why is this, Craig?
So a lot of that stats is from our work here at Starship. We've been maintaining data for nearly 3 decades now. And type 2 diabetes 20 years ago was very rare. At the moment, we get 70 new kids a year with diabetes. Most of them are type 1, but about 10% are type 2 now. And when we look back over 30 years, that was basically no one 30 years ago. And now we're seeing about 10% of our cohort. We're looking at children as young as 10 or 11 who are type 2, and we've done genetic testing, we've done antibody testing, and they truly are. So why is that the case? They almost always come from high-risk ethnic groups. In New Zealand, that is Māori and Pacifica. They are not the biggest kids at school, but they are on the heavier for weight range, and they almost always have a strong history of diabetes in the family. So there's a really strong genetic component, and then there's an environmental component. And it's interesting that people say, well, obesity is driving this. Obesity is one of the things that's driving this. The other thing that's driving it is they're being set up for a lack of insulin and becoming insulin resistant from being exposed to diabetes in utero often. And so we're looking at something that happened 10 to 12 years ago. So all groups in New Zealand now in paediatrics are seeing type 2s about 10%, type 1's a majority, and then rarer genetic forms.
How young are we talking that these kids have been diagnosed?
Our average in our paper is about 10 or 11. We do see some 7 or 8-year-olds that 20 years ago probably were not developing diabetes till 20 or 30, and 40 years ago their parents were developing it till 50 or 60. So it's like a domino effect. You know, there's diabetes in the family, the kids are getting exposed to high blood sugars in utero, getting born, almost what we call programmed. And that's getting worse as the generation comes through. And sadly, we see a number of families where the parents have got diabetes complications, and the parents aren't very old. Kids 10, mum and dad are 30s, maybe 40s. And unfortunately, we've had a couple where they've died of renal failure or they're on dialysis. That is the parents. So we're really keen to treat the children very aggressively to get the diabetes well controlled, we call it, or even better, in remission.
And so how do you front foot this? How do you get to the parents, to the mother, whoever it is, so that this doesn't become a cycle?
There's a lot of work going on to that. There's a lot of work in the universities about how do you break the cycle of mothers with diabetes and their offspring. I don't work in that space. All I can say is that treatments for type 2 diabetes and pregnancy in New Zealand have got so much better. The more we can do that, we will see the impact on that in 10 years' time. But as well as that, I think there's probably a whole area of research and public health of educating children and families. You know, if you had type 2 in pregnancy, your child is at risk for type 2, not when they're 30, you know, at risk before they hit teenage years. And we're probably just going to really need to front foot that and educate them regarding that to start with. Most of the kids we pick up haven't seen their GP regularly or haven't had diabetes checks and seem quite surprised. That's probably more at a public health level than my level. I sit literally in the hospital, in the old term, the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff.
Let's talk about symptoms that parents, sort of caregivers, even teachers should look out for, Craig, to, warning signs that these kids may have diabetes.
All diabetes, when you get your blood sugars high enough, will give you increased thirst, increased urination. So in the type 1 space, there's good evidence that if teachers at school notice a kid using the toilet a lot, they should say, well, you should go get a diabetes check. That's an easy one. About half of our type 2s won't get that high. They'll present with infections or just general tiredness or lethargy. We'd normally say if a child's at risk, if you're a family member who's had type 2, especially in pregnancy, to get your child to have a glucose check every year or two would be a very sensible thing to do.
If we don't get this under control, what's your concern? I mean, can New Zealand cope?
Well, it's going to cost, and I think we need to be able to fund some of these new agents, some of these new diabetic/weight loss drugs to target this group. I mean, we have a group of relatively small youth onset type 2. If we can target the new agents specifically for that, we will have a massive impact on their health, economy, and reducing their risk of long-term complications. But unfortunately, diabetes does cost. And I think generally, if you look at in places like India, they're talking about having millions, like 200 or 300 million with type 2 adults. And of course, these drugs are going to cost money. We don't have that group in children. We do have a lot of adults with this as well. At the end of the day, these new medications are game changers. And I think we're just going to have to invest in them.
So what's it like to actually live with diabetes? Well, RNZ journalist Guyan Espiner was diagnosed with type 1 7 years ago. Back then, he was 47 years old, fit and healthy and living his best life, when, out of the blue, his health went rapidly downhill.
The first thing I remember was my vision starting to go blurry. I was out for a run one day and I was looking into the distance and things were blurring up. And I thought, oh, well, I'm in my mid to late 40s. This is what happens. I'm going to have to go get glasses. Got them fitted out. Thought I was going to sort of have this John Campbell sort of studious look. I thought, this is kind of going to work all right. I'll get away with it. I didn't think much more about that. Then realised I was losing quite a lot of weight. And incredibly thirsty, like desert thirst, like you're just absolutely craving fluid all the time. And wondered what was going on. And this went on for, maybe 4 or 5 days. Went to the GP. He sent me out to a nurse who pricked my finger, and I'll never forget it. She said, "Oh my God, are you diabetic?" Which probably wasn't the most diplomatic thing to say. And I said, not that I know of. And the doctor came back and said, "You are diabetic and you're off to hospital right now." And I was taken to hospital. I think I spent 3 nights in hospital with drips and things in my arms and cleaning me out, and then they diagnosed me with type 1 diabetes, and they send you home with insulin and a blood sugar monitor, and that's it for life. That's your life for the foreseeable. There's no cure, so you have to manage your insulin and your blood sugars from then. But yeah, I was, I think, 47, and it was a huge shock and a big change in my life.
I can imagine. Just going back, when she pricked your finger, what made her think, are you diabetic?
Oh, yeah, well, so if we tested your blood sugar right now, you'd probably be sitting at about 5.2 millimole. I'll use the word millimole a little bit in this interview. You don't need to know what that means. You just need to know that for most non-diabetic normal people, you'll sit between 4 and 7. So if you keep those numbers in your mind, that's basically where you'll sit in terms of where your blood sugar is. Now, if you ate a supersized McDonald's meal, you might go up to 7 or 8 millimole as a non-diabetic, but the insulin from your pancreas would flood out and it'd take you back to that range. The body loves homeostasis. Think about it like a reserve bank targeting thing. They're supposed to keep inflation between 1 and 3. Your body does an incredible job of keeping your blood glucose between 4 and 7. Now, when the nurse pricked my finger, I was at over 20 millimole, which is it's just zero.
Wow.
If you went out and tested someone here at RNZ today and they were at 20 millimole, you'd know they're diabetic. There's just no way that your body could produce that sort of result. So it's a slam dunk. Now, it's possible that I could have been type 2, but it would be very unlikely. And so they knew pretty much right away. There are specific tests they can do to put it beyond doubt, but at that point it was a slam dunk. I was diabetic.
Is this something you were born with? How did you become at 47 a person who had diabetes?
Yeah, not at all. Not born with it. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease. They're still not exactly sure how it is triggered, but they think that it's most likely a virus that triggers it. And then your body attacks something that it thinks is a foe but is actually a friend, and that's what autoimmune conditions do. And in this case, it attacks the beta cells of the pancreas and kills them off, and so you stop producing insulin. Now, that can happen at any time in life. It's most likely to happen when you're a child. I think the most common onset age is about 7. They used to call it juvenile onset diabetes, and most people associate it with that. And it is a lot rarer in later life, but not unheard of. And so, yeah, I was a bit of an outlier getting it at 47. But yes, it's not something that you're born with. It's something that happens and happens very quickly. And before 1921, I think it was, when 2 very smart fellows won the Nobel Prize for discovering insulin, it was a death sentence and you died because the body cannot live without insulin. And unlike type 2 diabetes, type 1 diabetics produce almost no insulin. They might produce a little bit for a while after onset of the diagnosis, but we don't produce insulin. So we inject insulin. I inject insulin 5 times a day at least.
Wow.
Every day of your life.
That's huge.
Yeah.
When you went home that day, you go into hospital as normal 47-year-old fit and healthy guy, and then you come out as a diabetic. What was that like, even mentally for you, and how that changed your life?
Yeah, I think it is a big mental load in that you cannot take a day off from it. I'd be in deep trouble without insulin for a day or two. Psychologically, that's a big deal. If I was trapped in a snow cabin, or take your dystopian nightmare, if you're trapped somewhere without insulin, I'm gone. So that's an interesting psychological thing. The other thing is you have to manage those blood sugars. We talked before about keeping it between 4 and 7. Now, your body does that automatically, and it's incredible what the pancreas does. But I have to manage that by injecting the insulin and by calibrating that with the amount of carbohydrate or sugar in the food. To do that is actually fairly complex and demanding, because if you go too low, that's the acute and immediate risk, which we call hypoglycemia. So if you go under, we talked about 4 and 7, so 4's the floor. And if you go below that and keep going down, you'll end up in a coma. You'll go dizzy, sweaty, and then if you go further down, you get into real trouble. And you can even die if you go too low. So that's the immediate risk, and that's just by simply dialing up the pen, which I've got in my bag over at the desk at RNZ. If you put too much in, you can effectively overdose on insulin because you haven't got the calculation right about how much insulin you're taking versus the food that you are measuring that up against. The risk on the other side, if you go over 7 but well up over 10, 12, 14, 15 millimole, or the 20 millimole where I was when I got diagnosed, is if you do that for many years, that's where you get neuropathy and you get blindness potentially, and you get the amputations, which most of our listeners will have read about. We have a horrific record in New Zealand. We have many, many amputations every year.
If you haven't read about that, recent stats show there were nearly 1,200 amputations in the 2023-24 year. That's up from 764 in 2015-16.
Type 2 diabetes can lead to poor blood flow and nerve damage, which can mean cuts and injuries go unnoticed, and it's harder to fight infections, leading to serious complications, including amputations.
So if you're going to run high blood sugars for a long time, you're going to get those problems. If you are going to run low, you get the immediate or acute problem of hypoglycemia. So, yeah, it's like walking a tightrope to some degree, and that can be complex. And, yeah, it comes with a bit of a mental load as well.
He has managed incredibly well for the past 7 years, thanks to a keto-inspired diet, exercise, managing his stress, and 5 shots of insulin a day. But he did have a serious scare a couple of months ago.
I woke up extremely low and completely delusional, because it's like that feeling of starving oxygen to your brain. I was so low that my brain just was not working properly. I didn't know where I was, didn't know what I was doing. Thankfully, my daughter texted someone who rang an ambulance, and I spent the night in hospital for that, which was a bit scary. And that's the worst one I've had in 7 years of having type 1. But the short story is, as a type 1, injecting insulin all the time, you are going to get it wrong sometimes. And if you have too much insulin, you are going to go into hypoglycemia. And that technically happens to me just about every week. You go into hypoglycemia. Technical hypoglycemia, in other words, under 4 millimole. So usually you just sweat a bit, you can feel it, it's coming on, and you get your jelly beans. I always carry jelly beans everywhere because you have to. It's your sugar. And once you pop back over 4, you're fine, and you get on with your life. But all diabetics, type 1s, on insulin at some point in their lives are going to have a fairly significant episode of hypoglycemia. So it's important for people to know, if you're around, if you love someone, if you're working with someone who's in your life with type 1, you've got to know what to do.
He says that could be immediately giving them sugar or a soft drink, even pouring it into their mouth, or helping them with their insulin injection.
What will happen is their speech will start to slur, their brain will start to slow, which isn't great if you're a broadcaster. So I'm checking my blood sugars before I do a live show.
Nau mai, haere mai, piki mai, kake mai, kia ora e tiwi, and welcome to 30 with me, Guy and Espinel.
You don't want to drift into a lowish territory, and it can look a little bit like being drunk at times. You know, someone will start to get a bit sloppy and slur their speech a little bit. Yeah, look, just a quick, PSA. If you do know someone who's diabetic and you work with them, then it's a good idea to be conscious of those things and to know what to do if they get into trouble.
Now, 2025, I find it remarkable, and I'm guilty of this, there's still so much sort of misinformation and mystery when it comes to diabetes. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And firstly, I'm not going to be too heavy on people for that. If it doesn't affect you or someone you love, there's a hell of a lot going on in the world, so I'm not going to be critical of people who don't have knowledge of it. But I think the confusing thing for people is which one's type 1 and which one's type 2, and they are quite different conditions in many ways. I don't think a lot of people know that type 1 is an autoimmune condition which comes on pretty much immediately without anything that you've ever done, and is incurable and means you have to take insulin for the rest of your life. Type 2 is quite different in that it is preventable and it is curable in some senses, that you can go into remission from it if you can get those things under control. And not all type 2 diabetics will need insulin at all. Many won't. Some do. But as type 1s, we are dependent on insulin. We have to inject insulin for the rest of our lives. So that probably leads to some of the confusion. Sometimes you think it might be better if they came up with different names, because people can't remember which is which. So that probably does add to the confusion, I think.
There's now no confusing what type Guyan has. He's had it inked on his right forearm, boldly and proudly.
I've got a tattoo which is sort of in quite sort of cursive, fancy sort of gangster script. Up the side says diabetic. Then in quite sort of bold, bald font says type 1 on my wrist. I don't like wearing medical bracelets.
This is the alternative. I like it.
So I thought, and I'd always wanted to kind of do it, but I really love it. And it was a bit of an in-joke to me and myself. And also because it's a permanent condition, it ain't leaving me. I'm not going to have to put a cross through it like you might do with an old girlfriend. So it ain't going anywhere. And I'm also proud to be a diabetic.
Really?
Yeah, I'm proud to be a diabetic. And that's part of the reason I'm talking to you. I'm proud to be a type 1. It's part of my identity. It's shaped my life a lot. I'm probably healthier, I think, and in better nick than I've probably ever been.
Yeah.
So I've kind of been forced into this healthy lifestyle. And so I kind of feel good about that. And I'm proud to be a type 1. I kind of find myself drawing on it. It's a big part of my identity. So hence the ink.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Guyan Espiner and Dr. Craig Jeffries. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Mark Chesterman. I'm Amanda Gillies. Matua.